Go. So what I'm basically going to do is present for hopefully about an hour, maybe a little longer, and then we're going to open it up. And so if, depending on how people are feeling, we can do questions. Also, if people have dreams or dream images that they'd like to share or anything like that, I think we can try to make time for that. But we want to be, kind of thoughtful about how long we're sharing for, just to give people as much time as they want. So, and what I'm going to do here is share my screen, and I have prepared some slides, and I want to just say up front too with these slides. So a lot of these images come from Carl Jung's book, Psychology and Alchemy. And highly recommended book for reading, especially the first kind of introduction. It's some of the best stuff that Jung put out, and yeah, and it's I recommend that. I'm going to try to mention some books as we go and some different things to try to give people some clues on how to begin to do dream work. So there, in a certain respect, we're picking up where we left off from the previous seminars, the previous workshops, which was shadow work. And kind of the overarching theme, I guess, of my book, Shadow of a Figure Light, as well as the workshops, is the statement from Jung where he said that one does not achieve enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And I just think that that's such a profound statement, and it begs the question: what does it mean to make the darkness conscious? And so what we saw in shadow work was that a large part of us making the darkness conscious, especially for those of us in the 12 steps, is that we examine compulsion, right? Which I've presented as a doorway to the self. And the 12 steps are definitely a method for improving our conscious contact with ourselves, with our compulsions, with those things that drive us. And as we improve conscious contact with ourselves, with the self, you could say, then we also tend to get closer to the God image. And we also saw how the God image manifests through those compulsions or those complexes. And in a large way, this sort of defines the world of instinct. Um, and um, and what's taking place is that it's almost, and I like James Hollis says this, that it's as if the psyche sort of reaches up from deep within, right, and it begins to kind of pull down. That's I think depression kind of stems from that. So depression, alcoholism, addiction, all kinds of neuroses or psychological complexes. They're essentially emanations or eruptions from the unconscious. And what we're doing now is sort of pivoting, right, to the world of archetype. If archetype and instinct are sort of the same, they're on the same spectrum, right? Two poles of the same of a spectrum. Then if the complexes deal in the world of instinct, when we venture into the world of dreams, we're entering the world of archetype. And this includes sort of our emotions, I think, and very importantly, it includes our relationships in the world, right? And for me, a big part of that is my relationship to the opposite sex, my relationship to my own masculinity, as well as, in a huge way, my relationship to femininity. And so a big thing of what we're going to talk about here are those kinds of things, that sort of, Jung would say it's sort of the eros function of the male, which is how my masculinity relates to the feminine. And so that's sort of how this ties into where we've just come from. So again, if the complexes are sort of a manifestation of the self in this compulsive way, then dreams are a manifestation of the self or the unconscious in kind of the same way, in this way that the unconscious is trying to get our attention. So to start out, then I just have some kind of really almost like hyper simple dreams that are fun to look at. The first one is this: a close friend of mine had this dream just around the time she had begun intensive work with a therapist, which I think that the context is important. The dream is, I'm incapacitated. A green snake emerges from underground and bites both of my hands. Um, so when I heard about this dream, the thought was that, oh, it would appear that the unconscious is trying to get your attention, right? Because this was frightening, she kind of woke up like, out of it, sort of feeling a certain way, right? Like it was obviously scary. I've had similar dreams, that like spiders, like, and this, these are sort of the dreams that begin to manifest early on in this process, right? If we talk about individuation as a process, then these would be the kinds of dreams that are going to emerge probably around the same time we're dealing with complexes, right? So that they sort of complement each other. But I would have dreams about like spiders crawling on my feet, and stuff like that. So again, this is sort of like, these are dreams like this would be kind of like messages from the unconscious that are like, hey, you need to pay attention to me, the psyche, right? The unconscious, like that it's time that we sort of start, giving it some attention, and kind of move towards, I guess, what we would call a step 3 decision, right? That we really aren't in charge, right? The whole thing about this is that the ego suffers from a delusion of control. And so just like our complexities are trying to wake us up out of that delusion, our dreams are sort of telling the same story. I want to read this. This happened to me right around the time I started reading Carl Jung. And the story just goes, I'm jogging through the desert near Zion National Park. It's September. It's about 70 degrees. And I come around this corner between these two trees. And the next thing I know, I'm jumping in the air and I hear the word snake coming out of my mouth, right? And so my body instinctually reacted as I'm jumping over a rattlesnake that actually, it struck at me. And I looked down and I saw it like, within just, millimeters of the heel of my shoe. And I remember just this, I mean, it freaked me out, right? And I remember, because I just started dabbling in Carl Jung stuff, and I remember thinking like, wow, like it just felt a certain way, that there was some sort of a mirror taking place, right? But if you were to have a dream like that, then it would be very similar to the dream we just read about a green snake emerging out from underground and biting both of your hands. There's a scripture that comes to mind for those of my Bible thumping friends, Genesis 3:15, right? Where the Lord God tells, I think he's telling Satan, he says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. You will have power to bruise his heel, but he will have power to crush thy head. So, very, very interesting. There's a motif here, right? And that's what's important to recognize when we're talking about dreams and symbols and mythologies, right? Is that these motifs tend to run through them. And we want to look for the similarities. For example, some people don't have dreams about snakes, but they have dreams about dragons. Well, in terms of the unconscious, snakes and dragons basically symbolize the same thing. Snakes are simply dragons before they get their wings, if you will. And when we talk about crushing the snake's head, this is, I want to say this because it sort of underlies this entire workshop, right? We're crushing the snake's head, and in terms of recovery, right? There's that great symbol of the metaphor, right, of slaying the dragon, which is sort of it's a popular it's a phrase in pop culture about getting sober, right? We slay the dragon. And the more research, the more I get into my dreams and understand this stuff, I see how deeply archetypal that statement is just in and of itself, that really we are, as drug addicts and alcoholics, we're dealing with an archetypal sort of under kind of base layer of with this compulsion. And we talked all about that in Shadow of a Figure of Light. And so that's continuing now here, because a big part of this process is actually slaying the dragon. For example, here we have the snake, which has been pinned to a crucifix. So Moving on. So this is the first of 4 sessions that we're going to do. And I'm going to go ahead and start the timer. I forgot, but so this is the first of 4 sessions, and basically, um, yep. So an appropriate subtitle for this particular class would be Alchemical Symbolism in Modern Dreams. And the reason is because this is sort of the basis of interpreting dreams through at least a Jungian lens, is we're going to turn a lot to alchemical symbolism. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of introduce that and explain it as well as I can in such a brief moment of time. But this is what Marie-Louise von Franz says. She was one of Jung's colleagues. Jung trained her. She writes, to live symbolically is to live alchemically, turning the raw lead of existence into meaning. And isn't that true, right? In terms of, I mean, we all have this great sort of archetype that we can always look at to sort of mine meaning, which is the archetype of the alcoholic. That out of that sort of base, the lead, right? That the raw lead of just existence, right? And the incomprehensible demoralization, how we can actually through magic almost turn that into the gold of living this wonderful new life. So the alchemists obviously never figured out how to turn lead into gold, right? But they were quite obsessed with it for a couple of centuries, a couple of millennia, actually. But a few of them, especially near the end, they began to recognize that what they were producing was something they called philosophical gold, right? And they even started to get a sense that their symbols that they were dealing with, which were both chemical symbols, mythological symbols, astronomical symbols, right? They began to recognize in those symbols something that was happening inside of themselves. That their symbols became sort of a metaphor of their own psychic change. But I want to be clear that they weren't really conscious of that the way we are and the way we can talk about it, right? But that fact alone is what makes this sort of symbolical encyclopedia, if you will, called Alchemy. That's what makes it so useful for us, as we can use it to interpret our dreams. So in these seminars, we're largely going to be looking at we're gonna look at my dreams, right? And the process of sort of my own awakening as it manifests in my dreams. And this has been happening now for a couple decades, right? And I'm going to try to show that as best as I can. And what we're going to do is we're going to shine the light of Jung's commentary on alchemy onto my dreams. And that should help us kind of get a grasp at how to interpret our dreams. You know, and that's really the hope here is how can I try to help you guys to figure out a way to kind of find access into your dreams. I know for me, dreams always felt really distant. I didn't dream very much, so I didn't think that this whole thing of dream interpretation really fit for me. I just thought, it's probably nothing. I don't dream, so what am I supposed to do? And never, and on top of that, when I did dream, the dreams were so strange and stuff. They almost felt like the ruminations of my mind when I get caught up in my head and I just imagine all kinds of the worst kinds of things. I thought, well, dreams must be something like that. They must not mean much. But after I finished my book, I sort of was feeling kind of like I just didn't have anything to do. And I thought, if Jung and Campbell and Ettinger and these people that I look up to so much that have sort of become my mentors, Stephen Herman, in real life, they encouraged me to really take my dreams seriously. And so I thought, I was like, well, I'm going to give this a try. Then I'm going to do my best to really to figure this out, right? And what's happened is, over a relatively short amount of time, my whole perspective on the world has shifted. And so I can also say, like, from my own experience, that figuring out how to interpret our dreams can be a very life-changing action to take. So and this is what's important. So we're going to be looking at my dreams, but we could look at any number of dreams, any sort of dream series. In a lot of Jung's collected works, he actually has series of dreams. So, he'll literally list like 50 dreams of one of his patients just all in a row, and then he'll compare those to alchemy and show the correlations. So we're using my dreams because I've done the work and I've sort of tried to compare some of my dreams to alchemy. But this is the thing: we could use any one of your dreams as well, right? We could use my dreams, we could use Patrick's dreams, we could use Duncan's dreams. We probably wouldn't want to use Duncan's though, but we could, if you know, but we could, and the reason is because they're sort of archetypal, right? That and so and that what kind of takes place in the background of my psyche is also taking place in the background of your psyche. And it was the same thing that the alchemists were sort of toying around with many centuries ago. So this is the quote from that's on the flyer. It says, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul, which opens up to that primeval cosmic night that was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness extends." And I would also say this, that same psyche will remain psyche once our ego ceases to exist, right? And so by connecting into the dream world, we're literally connecting into the cosmos, the collective unconscious. My book, so I want to say this. I'm going to talk a lot about my book in some upcoming classes, like in sessions 2 and 3 and 4 a little bit. And it sort of falls right in the middle of this sort of saga that I'm going to try to portray in terms of my dreams. And what the book sort of represents, I guess, would be like it's the rational look at psychological change in my own mind in terms of the 12 steps with the Jungian twist, but it's hyper rationalistic. There is discussion of some symbols in the book. However, there's a glaring lack of femininity in my book, right? There's no mention of the divine feminine. There's no mention of the anima. And that really is a sort of criticism about where I was when I wrote the book. Now, it doesn't mean that the stuff that I wrote isn't true, but it means it perhaps is incomplete. There's some unfinished business there. And I think that what's happened since I wrote the book, because I've gotten into my dreams, is I've been able to begin to kind of tie the business up and wrap it up. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, as I said earlier, was my relationship to the feminine, because that's what's actually appearing the most in my dreams. I think that when we do shadow work, a lot of that is conscious work, right? And the 12 steps are a perfect example of this. We list our faults, right? We list the people we've harmed. We do an inventory. We talk about it. It's all really this stuff that's out here in the light, in the realm of consciousness. But when we get into the dream world, the landscape changes, right? In a major way. And what I've learned is that in our own dreams is where our personal myth will unfold, right? In the world of consciousness, that's where the sort of collective myth exists, right? That's the collective dream. But what we're looking at then is more of this personal myth. So I said that the landscape changes when we get into the world of dreams. And I think this is really important. And I kind of want to emphasize it, right? Because what we get with dreams is kind of a raw and undifferentiated expression of the unconscious. So we saw how, and we know, right, how raw alcoholism and drug addiction and other forms of behavioral issues can be. Very raw, but not very symbolic per se, at least on the surface. When we dip into the world of dreams, the whole thing changes, right? I think in the world of being awake, even when we're being driven by a complex like alcoholism, the ego still tries to keep things like at least a little bit in order so that it can get what it needs. And so there's always this sort of bit of hanging on so that things maybe will always look a little better than they actually are. But in the world of dreams, it's not like that, right? The ego literally goes to sleep. And so what we're getting is this really kind of unfiltered message, if you will, from the unconscious. And so, and and I think it's also important to point out that dreams, the symbols that appear in our dreams are reflections of things that are going on behind the veil of consciousness, right? Where actually words would fall short anyways. The unconscious is unconscious. So that means we can't describe it, we can't buy it, we can't sell it, we can't write it down, we can't paint a picture of it. The most we can do is express what we think it is through symbols. And I guess it's even safe to say it expresses itself to us through these symbols. So, um, and so that means that sometimes we can't even really describe the symbols. In other words, like Jung he recommends that at times we just have to let the symbols be. Just let the symbols be the symbols, but just to recognize that they're reflective of something taking place inside of us that we're unable to see. We looked at this in Shadow of Figure Light. The word symbolone means to throw together, such as similar word is parabola, which is like also like to throw. It's an arc, right? To throw. So the concept of symbols then is to bring together. And I love this quote from Jung. He says, alchemy is the dance of symbols. And I love this, the language of the soul, the psyche, trying to unite what life has torn apart, right? So we really are talking about a conjunktio, right? And that the goal of the alchemists was to sort of unite these disparate elements, right? And the same thing is taking place in our quest for individuation. We talked a lot about the conjunktio in the Shadow of a Figure of Light workshop, shadow work. And we're going to be talking a lot about the conjunktio here, but here we're going to really sort of boil the conjunktio down to the conjunction of consciousness with the unconscious. That's really what, in other words, we're trying to make the unconscious conscious. That's the same thing, right? So important here too, and I've kind of mentioned this, but so we could use any one of our dreams, right? Because we're all dreaming the same thing, but I want to point out too that the myth is also the myths are also the same. They're also the same characters. In other words, the symbols that appear to us in our dreams are the same symbols that have appeared in the Bible, in the Eastern texts, in the myth, in alchemy, and in all the myths, right? They're just repeated. The symbols are just repeating. This is what Jung says. Symbols are tendency whose goal is as yet unknown. We may assume that the same fundamental rules obtain in the history of the human mind as in the psychology of the individual. In psychotherapy, it often happens that, long before they reach consciousness, certain unconscious tendencies betray their presence by symbols, occurring mostly in dreams, but also in waking fantasies and symbolic actions. So, in other words, the symbols we read about in myth are the same ones that we're going to encounter in our dreams once we kind of figure this out. And I have this kind of written down in bold here. So this sort of means like there's a way of interpreting this to say that our dreams are actually religious visions. If you wanted to say that, you could. Meaning that the dreams are literally, it's like if you want to know what God's will is for you, well, whatever God is, it's speaking to you through your dreams. And I look, if someone would have told me that like 8 months ago, I probably would have been like, yeah, whatever. That's way too woo-woo for me. But having taken this study very seriously for the last 6 or 8 months, that's my feeling today. I would never want to miss what's coming to me through the dreams. It's just so profound and life-changing. This also means that the dreams that I'm having, right, are the dreams that you are also going to have or you are having. And I've seen this with my friends. Like Ming will tell me about dreams and I'm like, oh, wow, like I think I've had that dream, right? And of course, the nuance changes, but that there's essentially like once you learn how to kind of read them in this weird symbolical language, we figure out that they were kind of all the same. That's why we can learn to interpret them. And this, so this happened to me just last week, for example. And this is weird, and I'm going to try to convey this as best as I can. But we're driving across the desert, driving from Phoenix to Las Vegas, um, and I started thinking about some of my dreams and how they're so the meaning just keeps kind of growing on itself, and the same it's just the same sort of recurring dreams happening, and how these recurring dreams are basically like the same symbols that occur in alchemy, and that it's clear that there's something beyond the veil of consciousness that is trying to get our attention and trying to make something happen. We don't really know what it is. We can conjecture, but this really struck me. Jung was once asked, about his belief in God, the word belief, right? And Jung's response was, he caught a lot of flack for it, but he said very, very humbly, he said, "I don't believe, I know." And it really occurred to me, I think the other day, because like once you see that, like, wow, like it's too weird that we're all having the same dreams, and that the alchemists were kind of in the same weird space. Like, why is that, right? Like that's what Jung would say. He considered himself an empirical scientist, right? And the stuff that he was studying were these images that were emerging in his patients' dreams. And there's just books and books about how similar the dreams are for everybody. And so then we have this empirical evidence for the existence of something in the unconscious, or the unconscious itself, that's trying to supposedly make itself known to us and through us. And that's a frightening thought. To me, it's one thing to sort of have a belief in a higher power. But once the realization begins to dawn that it's actually real, that this stuff is real, and that there might even be scientific evidence to prove it, it's it almost just is too much to even handle. It makes me realize that I think it feels safer to just believe rather than perhaps to begin to know. And it reminds me of when Jesus was talking about, he was talking to some Pharisees, I think, and they asked him for a sign, and he said, an adulterous and wicked generation wants a sign. And he said that the sign you'll have is the same, that is the sign of Jonah, right? And Jonah had spent 3 days in the belly of the whale. Jesus was supposed to, he would spend 3 days in the tomb. But I think the message there, at least for me right now, is that if we want evidence, we have to go inside. We've got to go into the unconscious. The water always symbolizes the unconscious. So we are just moving right along. Approaches to dream interpretation. So the best way to do dream work, so just to start out, like the nuts and bolts, you want to get a pen or your notepad on your phone, and you want to have it sitting there literally like loaded and ready to go. Because writing dreams down is a lot like writing inventory. Nobody wants to do it at first. The and it just so happens that maybe writing down dreams is even harder, because we have dreams when we're asleep, and like you can't do anything when you're asleep, right? Um, I mean, for a long time, I didn't think I could do dream work, as I said, because I didn't dream. I wasn't dreaming. But what I've noticed is that with practice, it comes, right. And so like, for example, now, like what I've noticed is that I pretty much dream every night, but I don't really, I don't remember hardly any of my dreams. I'm just telling you that right now. But the thing is, the ones I do remember, I write down, and I don't always do it, but I'm always really happy when I do, because every so often one of these dreams is just absolutely life-changing. And this is the funny thing, that the ego will almost every single time tell me that dream's not that important, don't bother writing it down, because that's the ego's response to everything that it doesn't understand and that it can't comprehend. And so it really is this battle between the ego and the unconscious. Another thing I'll do sometimes is, when I'm laying down to sleep, I'll load up my notes. I turn down the brightness, and I put my my black screen on, so I, it doesn't kill me if I turn it on in the morning, or at night or whatever. And then I'll ask the unconscious, hey, just FYI, like if you're down, I'm down. Like send me a dream, and so I'm sort of trying to have an open attitude towards this, and to try to accept it, and yeah. And the thing is, the dreams almost always appear insignificant, but we want to write them down. Some dreams will be more archetypal than others, right? But even the most magnificent dreams, the ego, like it always takes me like a few days to realize how important the dream that I just had a few nights ago actually was. Because it takes time for it to like sort of like distill, right? And then finally I'm like, holy cow, this is huge, because I'll stumble across something in some literature or whatever, and it'll kind of awaken me and like help me to remember. Um, so, and I want to I want to talk about the ways we interpret dreams. We looked at this in Shadow of a Figure of Light, but basically this is Edward Edinger. He says there are 3 levels of dream interpretation. We distinguish, for instance, between the objective and the subjective levels of the dream, and between the reductive and the synthetic, and again between the personal and the archetypal. And then he gives us a good example of what he means by this. He says, similarly, a literal understanding of scripture corresponds approximately to a naive interpretation, a naive objective interpretation of dreams, which assumes that the meaning of the dream image lies in the concrete object. This is like, this kind of harkens to that funny sort of meme or joke or whatever, that my girlfriend's always mad at me because she thinks I cheated on her last night in her dreams, right? So that would be this sort of naive objective interpretation, right? To think that the person that I dreamed about is actually the referent in the dream, which that's not typically the case. This is very similar to interpreting the myths of like the Bible, for instance, as historical facts, right? And as we saw in Shadow of a Figure of Light, to do that is to sort of erase the numinosity of the archetypes. Let's see here. Oh, the next sentence says, sorry. The moral level of interpretation of our dreams would correspond to a subjective personal understanding of the dream, and the psychological approach to scripture would correspond to the archetypal interpretation of dreams. So in other words, there's sort of these layers, right? We kind of go from this literal perspective, then we kind of dip down a little bit into the reductive perspective, right? And then from there, we get down into the archetypal perspective. And I'm going to try to show how this happens in some of my dreams, because I think it'll help, because we can't really skip over the reductive, right? The literal, we don't need, but the reductive becomes pretty important. I would suggest that what we do in the 12 steps is something like reductive work, right? Because what Wilson says, we tried to get down to causes and conditions, right? That's shadow work, right? Like that's me like looking at my childhood and saying, okay, this and this and this used to happen to me when I was a kid. And so now I react to the world from that same perspective. And this causes me to do such and such. So that's like a reductive interpretation, right? But there's another layer below that, which is archetypal. And I think one of the most defining characteristics of an archetypal interpretation, which is like the bottom layer of the unconscious, right, is that the dreams begin to meld together, right? And when we're looking at these dreams archetypally, what we're seeing in them is a contiguous story. That doesn't mean continuous, right? One of the things about dreams is that they don't occur on a timeline, right? They're much more scattered. So, but once we begin to formulate a narrative through the dream, and we begin to see these recurring symbols that emerge in the dreams, we're starting to get an archetypal grasp of them, and that's kind of the money. That's what we're looking for. So we're talking about autonomous psychic complexes. Now, we encountered this phrase a lot in Shadow of a Figure of Light. These are the unconscious complexes that exist in the psychic background, right? So we talk about like the alcoholic mind. that would be an autonomous psychic complex. Every so often it drives the bus. We're just being driven, driven by fear, self-seeking, self-serving, self-pity, all of those kinds of things. So Wilson was really good at pointing out these autonomous psychic complexes. That was Jung's kind of scientific term for those complexes. When we talk about dream symbols, those are also autonomous psychic complexes, right? So that means that the being autonomous, this is one way of looking at this, right? And this is really, really weird, but I think it fits. It's that these symbols are actually sort of living their own spiritual adventure. They're autonomous complexes, right? So for example, the archetype of the alcoholic wants to get sober. Like it's trying to experience a change of its own, even though it's an unconscious complex. In my book, Shadow of the Figure of Light, I show how the archetype of the alcoholic is a variation of the trickster archetype, right? And that the trickster, in ancient times and today, the trickster undergoes a transformation, and the trickster morphs and becomes this shaman. So in the background of the psyche, in the unconscious, it's safe to say that this trickster archetype, it's attempting to undergo its own sort of spiritual metamorphosis to morph into a shaman. So the images that we're experiencing in our dreams, they're also attempting to undergo a psychic change. And that's just really weird, but it's true. That this, so what this means is, from an archetypal perspective, is that these images, these stories, these dream images, the myths, they're more than just metaphors for our existence, right? The crucifixion of Jesus is more than a metaphor of like my suffering, right? But that what it really kind of points to is that inside of all of us, there's these unconscious complexes that are attempting to make themselves conscious and to undergo a transformation. And so as an awakening ego, then we can sort of help to bring about that transformation. And that's kind of our job, right? If we say that, God wants to become human, as Jung said, then it has to do that through a participating ego. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. These are two quotes from where we can sort of derive this kind of weird idea, but I think it's an important idea to keep in mind as we go through this series. Jung said the archetypes have a certain effulgence or quasi-consciousness. Numinosity entails luminosity. And then commenting on that, Edinger says, unconscious complexes almost always have at their core an archetypal image. And we saw that with the archetype of the alcoholic, and they have a certain consciousness. As the complex is assimilated, the latent consciousness is extracted from the complex. In other words, as the ego helps the complex to become more conscious and sort of deconstructs it, then the ego adopts the luminosity that the archetype originally sort of had, right? And that's how the ego awakens and becomes, you could say, more and more powerful, more and more strong, more and more enlightened. Now, I want to share a dream. This is just a dream. This is actually the first dream that I ever wrote down. I think it was probably, I'm thinking 2020 or so. And this is the dream. On a rope, I swing out over the blue water of the ocean. A fish jumps and we lock eyes for a moment. So in alchemy, and Jung points this out, that archetypes, these things exist under the surface, right? So the ocean is always a symbol of the unconscious, of the collective unconscious. In terms of a psychological interpretation of the myth, the fish that are swimming around in the water are symbols of these archetypes, right? So they're sort of these dimly conscious beings that are like swimming around and living their own life, right? So now it's weird, but fish's eyes. So you may have some dreams like this, right? But fish's eyes are an important dream image. And Jung points that out, they're also some of the earliest images that come up in alchemy, right? And so, and this is what's crazy, is that the way, at least the way Jung lays out alchemy in his books, Psychology and Alchemy, Alchemical Studies, and Mysterium Connjunctionis, the sort of the um what I'm trying to say is that the sequence that he lays out, all of these alchemical symbols are the same sequence of the dreams that we start to have. And so, in other words, early on in Mysterium Connjunctionis, Jung talks about fish's eyes, and lo and behold, months after reading that, I find this dream of mine jotted in the margin of a book that I read a few years ago, and it was literally the first dream that I ever wrote down. So again, but what happens is me and this fish kind of lock eyes for a moment. And what that's a symbol of is that, and I don't know if at this point I've been reading Jung, and I might have started therapy, but I'm not sure. But what I see from this dream is that I'm beginning to sort of flirt around with, I guess, the unconscious, right? So I'm rope swinging out over the water, and a fish jumps, and we lock eyes, right? So there's some awareness there of sort of the collective unconscious. Like there's an awareness that I have of this thing, but there's also the reverse, is that it's also aware of me, right? So that there's a moment of connection there. And that's an important dream image, right? And it's very telling of where I was in the process. Now, I do want to take a little side note here to describe what I'm going to try to do in this process. Like I'm putting all these images up that are alchemical images. And I'm also going to try to talk about almost like as many symbols as I can, these random symbols like fish's eyes or like plastic parts and just all kinds of stuff, because I want to try to awaken you guys to a remembrance. Like if you've had dreams like this and stuff like that, you take note, like you jot it down, like, oh, Cody talked about this dream image. Feel free to reach out to me. Like I'll try to do some research if I can and send you some links and stuff to try to help you figure out how to do this dream interpretation. These seminars, they may feel sort of scattered and like unpolished, right? Contradictory, full of strange images and concepts. Alchemy feels the same way, especially Jung's books on alchemy. They're the most scatterbrained books you'll ever encounter. But the point is, though, that's the nature of this world we're entering into, right? Again, this is a more unfiltered manifestation of the unconscious when we get into dreams. So there's a reason it feels so just wacky, right? And it's normal, right? There's and the meaning of the dreams will continue to evolve as well. So all right, moving on. I want to give you guys a quick, this is only one slide of some background, right? So it's sort of some historical context. Jung said that any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral, but the dominant that grows from historical roots acts like a living being within the ego-bound man. And so the historical roots, I want to give you some background on that. So as I've said, Jung figured out that he could use alchemy as a way to kind of look at people's dreams. And he saw like all these alchemical texts as almost like an encyclopedia of dream symbols. He actually, I think, referred to it as the anatomy of the psyche. And Edward Edinger has a book called The Anatomy of the Psyche. And if you're serious about dream interpretation, I highly recommend buying that book. It's not available on Kindle, but it's a fantastic book, The Anatomy of the Psyche by Edward Edinger. So alchemy, though, was really an extension of an earlier mythological system that was called Gnosticism. Gnosticism was this movement that kind of emerged right around the birth of Jesus, a couple centuries before. And essentially, Jesus almost sort of takes on himself the archetypes that had been emerging through this time that the Gnostics were sort of tinkering with. And essentially what happens is Christianity developed, the idea of Christianity as a church develops out of Gnosticism, right? It's like Paul was kind of a Gnostic, right? And so the church fathers were sort of picking through these different Gnostic texts and deciding which ones were orthodox, right? Or we're good to go. Meanwhile, they were basically trying to destroy the rest of them. So what emerges then is this Christian myth, right? This Christian story. Um, as 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 the Christian eon kind of comes into play, around zero BC or whatever. So what was happening in the Western psyche was that ego consciousness was becoming more and more differentiated to the point where the opposites begin to manifest in like this really kind of a great degree, right? And Gnosticism is really defined by this separation, this kind of strict dualism, right? And the definition of consciousness is really an ability to discriminate between the opposites. And so as consciousness was increasing its hold on the psyche, right, the ego's growing in sort of dominance, then what happens is that the opposites sort of, they just become like more and more like just raging opposites, right? So what happens is good and evil then become like polar opposites, right? And the whole psyche develops this way. And so much so that even the God image is split, right? There's God and the Son, right? So there's two gods, right? Another interesting kind of parallel here is that as Jesus, the idea of morality then takes on this kind of different character, where it was at one point it was like if you obeyed the law, you were moral. Jesus comes and he introduces this new law, right? It's called, God is love, right? And he says the law is fulfilled in this: love your neighbor. And so even the idea of good then becomes like kind of hyper differentiated. So once the church fathers kind of develop this ecclesiastical creed, right? They basically try to, any of the symbols they don't adopt from Gnosticism, they stamp out. And in a sense, but what happens is these symbols, because they're archetypal, they don't die off. They sort of just go underground for a while. And they eventually kind of reemerge in the minds of the alchemists. And so this is a really important quote right here. This is from Jung, that essay in the first chapter of Psychology and Alchemy. He says, the central ideas of Christianity are rooted in Gnostic philosophy, which, in accordance with psychological laws, simply had to grow up at a time when the classical religions had become obsolete. Now, this is where we go back to that story we read in Shadow of a Figure of Light, about the great Pan is dead, right? The nature gods had died away. And so it was a psychological law that this new sort of religious system would emerge. Then Jung goes on, alchemy was rather like an undercurrent to the Christianity that ruled on the surface. It is to this surface as the dream is to consciousness, and just as the dream compensates the conflicts of the conscious mind, so alchemy endeavors to fill in the gaps left open in the Christian tension of opposites. Now, this is really important. From a psychological perspective, we've talked about how Christianity is sort of an incomplete system of religion. It's hyper fixated on just the good side of the cosmic equation. As such, it has an incomplete God image, and it also lacks a certain feminine element. And we're going to talk about that next week as well. So according to psychological law, this sort of undercurrent develops in the collective psyche, and it emerges as alchemy, right? And what we see happen in the collective also takes place for the individual, right? So for me, for example, and I'll try to show this next week, that in my own psyche, in my own relationship to this sort of collective myth that I've adopted just because I'm born into the West, that what emerges sort of unconsciously, right, is a response to that. It's a compensation. So what I'm saying here is that our dreams are going to basically compensate what we are lacking in our conscious, religious, or spiritual program. And that's really important, right? I want to emphasize this. So as Christianity rules on the surface, alchemy kind of emerges as this undercurrent that's meant to compensate. The same thing happens to us individually. whatever our spiritual practice is on the surface, our dreams very likely are providing commentary and compensation on that. So, all right. The doorbell just rang. I don't know. I don't know who it is. So we talk about symbol formation. And this is why it's so important that we use these symbols. So like the question as to why alchemy, why not something else? And this is Jung tells us why right here. We must turn back to those periods in human history when symbol formation still went on unimpeded. That is, when there was still no epistemological criticism of the formation of images, and when, in consequence, facts that in themselves were unknown could be expressed in definite visual form. So essentially, the alchemists are tinkering around with chemicals and elements and different things. They have no idea how chemistry actually works. And so naturally, what they did was project their own psychology into the elements. And this is what Jung says, the period of this kind closest to us is that of medieval natural philosophy, which reached its zenith in the 17th century, and in the 18th century gradually left the field to science. Alchemy attained its most significant, natural philosophy attained its most significant development in alchemy and Hermetic philosophy. Here, as in a reservoir, this is really important. Here, as in a reservoir, were collected the most enduring and the most important mythologisms of the ancient world. It is significant that Hermetic philosophy was in the main practiced by physicians. And so, in other words, in this sort of treasure trove of alchemical writings, what we have gathered is essentially all like the most recent unadulterated conglomeration of these mythological and archetypal images. They've all sort of settled down into this like kind of nasty swamp that's called alchemy. And so once we figure out how to sort of access this encyclopedia, then our dreams are going to start to come alive. Jung considered alchemy a form of active imagination, and we talked a lot about that in one of the sessions. So, and this is what he says: alchemy is a projected psychology that was a representation of the individuation process by means of chemical substances and procedures. And so the alchemists lived in a time that was far less scientific and far less rational. And so they were basically, they're more closely connected to the symbolic world and the symbolic function of the psyche. And they were also very learned. They were doctors, and they would do these experiments, and they would tinker around, and they would copiously take notes, right? And so, for example, just one quick example is lead, right? If you put lead on a fire and get it really hot and it starts to kick up all these vapors and stuff, and then you inhale some of that vapor and you almost die because you get ill. Well, that's why they consider lead to be so evil, right? This sort of evil, dark substance, right? Because it makes people sick. So rather than what happens to someone physically, like the way our brains think about it, they would automatically just project the devil into the lead. And so that sort of gives you an example of how they come up with this kind of system. Now, the reason that all of this matters is because, like I said, Jung uses alchemy to look at these sort of psychological symbols that appear to us in our dreams. He says alchemical images often appear in dreams and fantasies of modern individuals who have no notion of alchemy. And I want to read this because this really starts to take place in my own story. In just a couple minutes, we're going to look at kind of some initial images that I had. So, and the first clue, and I think this is important too, the first clue that Jung ever got that alchemy would actually work to help interpret dreams was when a patient came in and told him that he had had a dream of an eagle, that the eagle basically takes off and starts flying, and then while it's flying, it turns and starts eating its own wings. So his patient had this dream and told him about that. And Jung was really moved by this dream. He felt that it was of an archetypal nature, but he didn't really have, he just had, it was like too deep for him. He couldn't figure out what it meant. He essentially, the only thing he could come up with was that it was like the Ouroboros, which is this image, the dragon or the snake eating its own tail. Then a couple years later, he comes across a thing called the Ripley Scroll, and he sees this image. And what it is it's a king basically it's an eagle with a king's head, and the eagle, as it's flying, it turns and it starts eating its wings, right? And so, and this just kind of blew his mind, because the image was like too particular to just be accidental. And so he began to really look at alchemy from this really kind of deeper way. And this is the scroll right under this image says, "The bird of Hermes is my name. I eat my wings to keep me tame." And so it really is an interesting image. Jung tells us about the eagle that the eagle is a symbol of the spirit, by which the alchemist meant all the higher mental faculties such as reason, insight, and moral discrimination. And so, so essentially, then what Jung is able to now interpret this image to mean is that rather than just the eagle kind of trimming itself to keep itself tame, if the eagle is a symbol of the spirit, then and the king also represents the same thing, kind of this higher consciousness, right? The king represents the overarching conscious attitude of an individual. And so when that attitude is able to start plucking the wings to keep himself tame, then there's sort of a level of development there. That's at least how I would interpret this right now. So as we get closer, so that's sort of this brief introduction on why we're using alchemy. I know it's been long and laborious, but it's important, because as Jung said, these images tend to emerge in the psyche of people who have no notion of alchemy, and that has been the case for me over and over. So it gives me probably a clue that it's probably happening for all of us. So one of the sort of repeating themes that I've had in my dreams recently has been me in a canoe out at sea, right? And when I saw this image, I was like, wow, that's exactly what it feels like in my dream. Studying my dreams has given me this ability to kind of look at the whole of my life from this sort of really, it's like the thread that kind of runs through my life. You know, alcoholism and drug addiction have been that also, but also they only play a part, right? That there's kind of this other thing that's taking place too, which is really a journey of making the darkness conscious, right? It's a night sea journey. And so basically, but and I'm going to go back and just give you some history. So in 2009, I was really strung out. I was on meth and heroin, and essentially, and what happens is, I'm like super strung out, and me and my mom getting in this big fight. All right, and growing up, I was always sort of the scapegoat. So I grew up in an alcoholic home. Both of my parents are alcoholics. And so, and we get in this big fight, and she is meaner to me than she's really ever been. Like it's like shocking to me. And what I do is I reacted to, and pretty much for the first time, and really the only time, I was really mean back, and I really just kind of let go. And I said some of the most horrible things. And I really kind of stood up for myself, right? As I said, I was the scapegoat growing up. So this was like a long time coming, I guess. And so this is like a really big deal for me, right? And I only was able to piece this together a couple weeks ago, but what happened right after that is I felt compelled to write poetry for some weird reason. I was like, oh, I'm going to go down to the art store, and I stole some pens and some notepads, and I went back to the dope house, and I sat down, and I started writing poetry, and I wrote a poem. And I'd never really written poetry before, whatever, but this is the poem that emerged. And just keep in mind, this is 2009. This is what and I'm not going to read you the poems because they're not good, but what's important here is the images that come up. So as I sat meditating in a lush green forest, an angel in female form descends from heaven. She has an instrument that is strung with the threads that tether the souls of humankind to the cosmos. So in other words, so this, okay, just like all dreams, right? On the surface, this sort of dumb little poem seems silly. And I would probably say the same thing. It seemed kind of silly. However, this image was very numinous for me. the reason is because it stuck with, like, it just stuck with me. Whatever this female image was, um, I was it just, I just sort of took it as my own, and I just kind of held on to it. I didn't understand what it was. One day, the thought came to me that it was named Thalia, which I had never heard of before. And if I had, I had forgotten. Thalia, it turns out, is the ninth of the Greek muses. She's the god of pastoral poetry and comedy, I think. But either way, like, I just sort of had this image, and it like really stuck with me. Um, and so I gotta, I just want to say this, like, I end up, getting even more strung out for a couple more years, and I finally get sober in 2013, and this image is still sort of right here in my consciousness. It stuck with me for that long, and even this is the theme that I'm trying to put across, is this image comes and she never goes away. This is what Jung says. And by the way, she is a representation of the anima. So the anima is, the anima would be the female. And this is important because we're talking about my dreams, okay? And I've said I'm going to talk about the divine feminine. And I'm a male, so I'm going to be giving you the perspective, the male perspective, right? There is a female perspective, and I'm going to try to mention that as much as I can as we go. But what I want to say about this is this image for me represents the anima. The anima is the female representation of the male unconscious, right? In other words, that when this personification of this female emerges in the psyche of a male, she is going to be a representative of the unconscious. Now, on the flip side, if I'm having dreams of another man, like a strange man that's basically my equal, that will be a representation of my shadow. Okay. But when a female comes around, it's a representation of the anima. Now, the same thing for a woman. If a woman dreams about another strange woman that's basically just like another human being, that's going to be a representation of her shadow. But if she dreams about a woman, like a divine woman, then that would be a representation of the self for a woman, right? And we'll try to start kind of parse through this stuff. But in my own psyche, when this image occurs, this is what Jung says. The anima belongs to those borderline phenomena which chiefly occur in special psychic situations. They are characterized by the more or less sudden collapse of a form or style of life, which till then seemed the indispensable foundation of the individual's whole career. When such a catastrophe occurs, not only are all the bridges back into the past broken, but there seems to be no way forward into the future. One is confronted with a hopeless and impenetrable darkness and abysmal void that is now suddenly filled with an alluring vision. The palpably real presence of a strange yet helpful being, in the same way that when one lives for a long time in great solitude, the silence or the darkness becomes visibly, audibly, and tangibly alive, and the unknown in oneself steps up in an unknown guise. Now, this is a really important statement for me, right? Because, and like I said, it's really weird that I hadn't put together the emergence of the anima, this Thalia character, in my own psyche, with the fight with my mom until just literally a couple weeks ago. But I realized then and this again, this would be a form of active imagination, right? I just thought, I'm going to write some poetry, and this is what emerged. And I just was free flowing, and this image emerges, which could be seen as nothing, but the fact that it sticks with me for so long, it tells me something. And only later did I learn that it's the anima and stuff. I had no idea about any of this Jungian psychology in 2009. And what's important for me here is that this image comes as a compensation, right? That there was a catastrophe, and that the bridges back into the past, most likely with my family, those bridges were burned, and it was only forward. And what happens now is in that moment, the psyche produces an image, a helpful being, right? That becomes sort of a psychopomp, someone that's going to guide me into the future. So And there's a couple more things that I'd like to maybe touch on, but I wonder if I should just but so I'm going to just talk about this kind of one more aspect of this, and I'm going to just I'll send these. Um, I'll send the slides so you guys can read the slides, but I'm going to skip to the end here. Um, there's there's two things I'll touch on this and then we'll see how long this takes. So Jung said that the more remote and unreal the personal mother is, the more deeply will the son's yearning for her clutch at his soul, awakening that primordial and eternal image of the mother, for whose sake everything that embraces, protects, nourishes, and helps assume maternal form, from the alma mater of the university to the personification of cities, countries, sciences, and ideals. When Paracelsus says that the mother of the child is the planet and the star, this is in the highest degree true of himself. So what Jung's saying here is, and I forgot to introduce this, Paracelsus was a great alchemist, and his mother died when he was like 8 or 9 years old. And he turned really with like everything towards the university and the church, which these Jung tells us that these are maternal or feminine symbols, right? So in other words, if you have dreams of cities, countries, sciences, ideals, group, political parties, fellowships, AA, NA, churches, those are all maternal symbols. They're feminine symbols. So what Jung is saying here is that the fact that Paracelsus's mother died, it created, so for him specifically, he had a very interesting relationship with the church, because and I think this applies for a lot of people in ACA, which is why I wanted to bring this up. When our parents don't provide a proper buffer between ourselves and the archetypes, like the mother archetype, the feminine archetype, in terms of the father, right? The father archetype, the masculine. Then basically what Jung is saying here, and there's another quote too, from Edinger, is that when that buffer doesn't exist in real life, then what happens is that the child will tend to, there's almost like it's just like a highway into the archetypal psyche, right? So that parents typically will provide a buffer for these archetypal energies, but when the parents aren't showing up the way good parents should, the children tend to really move towards the archetypal components, right? So this and there's so when it happens like in the female situation, like with the lack of a good mother figure, then there could be a turn towards the church, a turn towards the university, the alma mater, whatever sort of fills the archetypal void, right? It can be both helpful as well as detrimental. In the next slide, we talk about sort of the father archetype, and so Jesus kind of suffered from this. Jung points out, right? Jesus had, in the psychology of Jesus as a human, he didn't have an earthly father. He was basically adopted, right? And Jung compares him to a Gnostic figure named Mani, who was also an orphan, and who also suffered from this sort of lack of a father. And I think we could say the same thing about Bill Wilson, right? Because what takes place is these people go on to basically create religions, right? Because the father archetype isn't there. And so there's no buffer between the individual and the archetypal, the father archetype's there, but there's no father figure to buffer it. This is what Jung says. This state of affairs, a missing personal father, this is actually Edinger. This state of affairs, a missing personal father, combined with a particular openness to a connection with the archetypal father, is a recognizable pattern in the psychology of certain men. So Edinger sees this all the time because he works with clients, right? So when a father is missing in the early formative years of the child, a hole is created at the personal level of the psyche. There is a direct availability or openness between the ego and the deeper layers of the archetypal psyche, especially the father archetype, since this is the one that has not undergone the usual personal incarnation through a relationship with a human father. There is no buffer between the ego and the archetype. In many single-parent families, the absence of the father is quite disastrous. The emergence of a religious prophet is not the usual consequence. Lack of a father is more likely to breed an individual in whom the primitive, atavistic aspects of the masculine archetype erupt. But when the ego is sufficient to the task, archetypal wisdom can break through, and there are the makings of a prophet. Christ, in this situation, experiences himself as the son of his heavenly father. Manny knows himself to be the heir of Scythianos, the ancestral father. Although the personal figure is missing, the archetypal wisdom flows through directly, so to speak. And so I think that this applies, to a lot of us in the situation that we find ourselves, having darkened the doors of 12-step fellowships, is that a lot of us suffer from this kind of same situation, right? And it's important, at least in my case, that these images will emerge to compensate for that stuff. And what I want to say in closing is just that. So what I talked about today, I just wanted to get up to introducing this figure, the anima, right? The unconscious personification for me as a male. And because what happens is over time, this figure begins to develop more and more. Now, for many years, she had emerged, and I thought about it a lot, but there was no way for me to sort of impart any meaning on it whatsoever. I didn't know what to make of it. And so I'm going to talk about more developments of that figure next week, as well as some more dreams that when it kind of begins to develop more and more. So, and what I'm hoping for now, we'll just open it up. And if anyone, wants to share, if anyone has dreams, questions, anything like that, happy to try to answer them or point you in the right direction the best I can. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Cody. I've made it possible for everyone to unmute if you would like to.
You are now muted, Duncan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh no, let's
Thank you so
oh,
much.
yeah, let's Cody. Yeah, thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Cody.
Great job, Cody. Great job.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you,
Thanks, Cody.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Cody.
much. All right. So we'll move to questions and answers, shares. I'll try to keep these short so that we can fit in many people as possible. I'll also weave in a couple of questions that are in the chat. Let's see. I got to change my view here. Okay, Gail, come on in, Gail.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Cody. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm really, really pleased that you're doing this series. Thank you so much. So I've got a couple of dreams that are jumping straight forward. Maybe I'll just ask you about this one. There's one where I'm on it's sort of like a castle building, and I'm on the sort of upper sort of balcony area, and there's a massive pendulum that's swinging, and it's hitting the castle wall like a wrecking ball and destroying the building that I'm standing on, and I'm standing above watching this happening. Do you have any tips about how to interpret that?
I do. And so, no, and I think this is fabulous. There's a couple things I want to say up front. So I am happy to field these questions about dreams. Some of them will be pretty, I think, fairly clear to me, like this one. I got an idea about it. Others, I'm just want to tell you up front, like I might not have anything with some of them. Also, I'm going to be as gentle as possible. It is these dreams get to kind of these underlying things in us that may touch on something. So if you just keep that in mind, and if you feel like, hey, just go really lightly on this one or some of that, I'm fine with that also. And I could be completely wrong as well. So, but this is how I would interpret that dream. So I think the castle is an interesting figure. So because it represents the kingdom. And so the king is in the castle, and at least from a male perspective, which I think this applies for females as well, is that the king is a representation of consciousness or the conscious dominant. So that can apply to the culture. It could apply to the 12-step fellowship that you're a part of if you are. It could apply to the church. It could apply to your nation. And I think I love this image because there's something taking place. The psyche is sort of methodically the psyche is methodically kind of dismantling whatever that conscious dominant is. That's what I would say that this dream is. So I think to me, it seems like a pretty good, I would say that it bodes well for you that you're doing some hard work and you're challenging kind of your core beliefs, and that the structure is falling apart, and that's scary, but that it seems like you're probably in good hands. So let me grab that phone real fast if I can find it.
Thank you.
Great.
Question from the chat. Suggestions for recalling dreams.
So suggestions for recalling dreams. I heard, and I didn't miss anything. So this is, oh no. Everyone froze. Ming, are you froze?
You're back. We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, I couldn't see you guys for a sec. Or everyone was like, especially you, Duncan. Tips for recalling dreams is really to make a practice out of it. So, and like I said, I mean, so like every night when I go to sleep, I kind of turn on my do not disturb and stuff, and I open up my notepad. I have one notepad that I put all of my dreams on, and I scroll down to the bottom of it and put in the date. So I'm just totally prepared to write down the dream. And honestly, I try to write down everything I can remember. The stuff I don't remember, I don't take, it's just like, okay, well, it's gone. But the things I do remember, I try to write them down. This is also really important. If I have an image that appears to me so you'll see later on, I woke up, or in the dream, I was holding a card and it had an image drawn on it. Didn't think much of it because I couldn't remember any of the details around the dream, but I decided the next day that I was going to just sketch the image. I just drew it out, and then I just did a little active imagination on it. I put some colors in and just kind of left it at that. But then over the next like 3 or 4 days, the image just came alive, and I just learned so much from it. And it just became this, I'm fascinated by it now. So the key is to just do your best to write down as much as you can remember and put it in an app so that you can search if you need to. And then I always transfer off the notepad onto a Word document, just so I make sure I don't lose it. So I'm sure there's apps too. You know, you can record yourself if you, I can't do that because it would wake up my partner, but that's a great option too. You know, I kind of wish I could, because I think I'd get more, but yeah.
Thanks, Cody. Remember, folks, we're recording, so if you don't want your voice recorded, you can put your question in the chat. And we also have more hands than we have minutes left in the session, so please keep your question brief, and Cody, please be as concise as you can with your responses. Kayla, come on in.
Hi, thanks, Cody. Yes, a couple of questions. One, I have a lot of flying dreams, and I just wondered if you got any tips on lucid dreaming. Thanks.
Yeah. So when we talk about dreams and we use alchemy as a sort of framework, then what we have are different alchemical processes. So one of them is called sublimatio, which means to sort of fly, right? So you can do some research too about so like, for example, for me, this is a big one for me. The Peter Pan image is really an important one here. Because so the being in the air is highly representative of sort of like the intellectual, spiritual versus soulful, right? In dream work, we want to differentiate between the spirit and the soul. The spirit will be the like our relationship to the 12 steps or whatever it is. It's kind of our spiritual program that's out here in the open. And notice I'm like pointing to my right here, right? Like the direction is consciousness to the right. And I just did that unconsciously, but the soul then is this other thing that's kind of below the surface, the feminine, right? And so if you're having a lot of, so for example, for me, I'll have a lot of dreams where I'm climbing like ladders or climbing up something. And then very often I have dreams where I'll be racing up a hill and then the car won't make it and I'll start tumbling back down the hill. So these are symbols of what's taking place within the retort of the alchemist, like the hermetically sealed vessel, right? And it's that shaking, right? The mixing. And so so the dream of flying all the time would mean that either you need to spend more time in the air, perhaps you're spending too much time on the ground, or you might be spending too much time in the air and it's time to let the wings out of the sail and come back down to the ground. The second case is my case a lot. I need to be spending much more time on the ground. So, and you could look up, like if you go to ChatGPT or DeepSeek, you can always ask, like, what does sublimatio mean? And what do dreams about flying mean? Stuff like that. As far as lucid dreaming, I don't really know. I don't lucid dream. And I don't know how to do it. So thanks, Kayla.
Thank you, Lamont Mountain.
My man Duncan, how you doing, buddy? Hey, Kobe, good to see you guys again. And gals, thanks for being with me on this day. I was not gonna come on because I know how deep Cody get. He gets so deep, he got to talking about Jonah and the whale in the belly's whale, in the whale's belly. And that was symbolic to me as being in hell. You know, two places screaming out from hell and the whale's belly. I was like, yeah, take that. You know, I try not to get too deep off into and I looked up the word alchemy, and I didn't know it meant witchcraft, sorcery, and what else, black arts and voodoo, man. I almost got off the meat. I said, ooh, he's deep, you know, but you know what? I'm always open-minded. You know, you got a lot of, I don't know how your mind handle it, but you know what? I have to remind myself, everyone is on their own journey. You also talked about dualism. Christian Science talks about all this kind of stuff, just different terminology. And I'm glad I can, you know, touch on both sides, but I try to stay on Genesis 1:26, where it said we're made in the image and likeness of God. Because sometimes, as you were saying, that dualism, you know, you can get deep off into that spiritual realm of sordid and morbid thinking, you know, because we have been affected by alcoholism, and that can be, he don't have a monopoly on that. So, you know, you were talking about God love, and God is also terror too to the sinner, you know, so he can manifest himself through the devil. Thanks for listening. I'm gonna drop the mic. Bye.
Thank you, Lamont. Wesley.
Yeah, thank you so much, Duncan. Hi, Cody. Thank you so much for your presentation. And Cody, I have been dreaming a lot, but the good thing is that I've been writing them down, and also most of the dreams I have been able to get some interpretation. But there's one that two of them that really stands. I dreamt of an insect, and then out of this insect, an egg popped out of it. And then also I saw myself being in a lift, like an elevator, and I was flying, like I was going with it all the way up. Yeah, so please help me to interpret. Thank you.
Yeah, these are great images. So, and I would suggest, so like I said earlier, like I use Deep Seek because I like the name, like we're going into the unconscious. So you can always ask, so you could put it in like, hey, what does this image, what does an insect symbolize in a dream? So I would say that I'm having a hard time remembering. Jung does talk about insects. It would seem that the insect would be something to do with a more kind of deeper layer of the unconscious, like where we're sort of connected to the animals and the bugs and the trees. However, I'm sure that there's a deeper meaning than that, and so I would recommend looking that up. The egg is a huge symbol. That's like like Jung in a lot of his drawings that he did in the Red Book, like he had eggs. So you think of like a cosmic egg, right? The egg is a mandala. So it sort of has this center, and it's like a self-sustaining, ecosystem there that is going to hatch into something, different. So, and I think that that's a very important symbol that I would suggest that it's essentially saying that there's a transformation coming, like a new being is getting ready to emerge. And maybe a fun exercise for like an active imagination would be to ask yourself or the HP or the self or whatever is, how do I take care of this egg to make sure it, comes to term, and that whatever's in there hatches successfully. So I think those are great images to play with.
Thank you, Pooja.
Hi, thank you so much, Cody. That was a very, very informative session. My question is, if you have any thoughts around, so I've dreamed about cows. For some reason, they enter my dreams now and then. Then lately, a lot of family get together. Could be some sort of impending celebration that I don't really get to see. But there's a sense of impending celebration, either an anniversary or something like that, or even sometimes a funeral of somebody, and having a lot of family members in the picture. And finally, I have one question around, by the way, just to mention the funeral part, I'm a Hindu. Yeah, so the vibe is slightly, of that nature. And final thoughts is, okay, so you mentioned about the symbolism, but I have a lot of dreams around the sensation of fear in the body. Even if there is nothing dangerous in the scenario, but the sensation of fear is very vivid for me. So is there some kind of a roadmap, just like there is for symbols, for sensations as well? Thank you.
Thanks. Those are great questions. And so I think certainly the cow would have probably a pretty kind of specific meaning. I don't know a lot about Hinduism, but I know that, cows can be sacred. So I would research that and try to find the meaning in there of sort of what speaks to you about, and just because there will be tons of symbolism around that. I know, I was just reading this morning that cows and bulls, they're representative of the feminine energies. So that's however that applies to you is really kind of an individual thing, right? Like, where are you at with your relationship? Probably your relationship to religion, to the doctrines and the dogmas of their religion. I also dream about family reunions a lot. One of my most really important dreams took place at a family function, which is really interesting. The family is sort of the house, the sort of the container of all of our, probably, I mean, you would say character defects in my case, like the way, like, in other words, I need to individuate away from the way my family interacts with the world, with the masculine and the feminine energies. And so typically for me, the dreams that I'm having about family, and family reunions and whatnot tend to be of me sort of leaving the situation, and growing up out of it. So I'll share a dream about that in the third week. So I again, a lot of this stuff, I wish I was better at interpreting dreams. I'm pretty new at it, so I don't know quite yet how to answer all these questions. But what I would recommend is to definitely journal and write down your associations and do some research. Like you want to kind of become like a little scholar and go into Chat GPT, go into DeepSeek, ask what the dream symbols mean. And you can ask them straight up, like in a Jungian context, what does this mean? And it'll give you some ideas. It won't always be exactly right, but there's ways to interpret this stuff. And it really I think for me, it really started to come alive when I started doing some homework around the images. That's when I was like, wow, this is really deep stuff. So thank you for your question. I love it. Also, the fear, the emotions that emerge in dreams, they are very telling. I know that for me, like when I wake up in fear and stuff from a dream, I really want to pay attention to why. And I do want to say this too, that the dreams that used to feel really intense for me have lost, for the most part, have lost their intensity. And like often, like dreams that would have usually scared me now actually provide a really deep sense of relief, which is, so there's like a weird twist. Like for example, the other day I dreamed that I burned down a village and like the people that lived in the village were going to die, but I woke up like in a really good mood. But so often the images that we think would be bad are actually good, and then vice versa. The images that feel really good might be maybe not so good. So just stuff to think about.
Thanks, Cody. Couple things from the chat. First thing is a share. This year, I'm working on a chariot dream / experience during holotropic breath work. It brought me back to tarot and has opened so many doors, windows, fascinating work, this dream work. If I wake in the night, I ask my HP to provide me with dreams I need, and I fall back asleep that way. Thank you. This is so timely. And then there's one more that ends with a question for you. I think this is a dream. I'm underwater. I'm comfortable. A pregnant woman comes into the water. We're both now underwater, and I'm holding her as she gives birth. In the same dream, I heard Iona many times. I woke with Iona, Iona. There's a lot more to that dream, but to sum it up, helping a woman give birth underwater.
Yeah. So it might be, so I think that whether this dream was had by a male or a female would be pretty important in this case.
Female.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is really the symbolism in this is really interesting. I mean, there is an alchemical story of the king who goes underwater, and he's like underwater in like a glass house. And the queen is in there, and they kind of do their thing, I think, and they have a baby. So there's a lot of really profound symbolism in this dream. I think it could mean many things as far as what it means to help other people, or whether which person, I mean, you're clearly both of the people underwater as well as the baby that's being born. And so it's interesting to look at the situation that's because very often it would be a man and a woman, that would create a baby. So I think it's highly interesting that it's two females. Whether that's speaks to sexuality or not is for the individual to really kind of parse out on their own. The dreams are very often there's a sexual undertone in all of this stuff, in alchemy, in mythology, in our dreams. And the reason is because what we're trying to produce is a conjunctio, right? And so in alchemy, what happens is the sun and the moon, they come together, they conjoin, and they create a child. And that child is called Mercurius. And so there's a lot of sexuality. There's a lot of sex that's going on. So, and we see this in the myths too, right? I mean, obviously, Jesus and Mary. And so there's a lot of, so that's always important to look at. I know for me too, like on a personal note, my dreams they pretty much, so I don't necessarily identify as like a straight white guy, even though I pass as one. But my dreams are, they do indicate that to a certain extent, right? So for me, the sex isn't always straight up just heterosexual in my dreams. There's always kind of some weird twist that speaks to my own sexuality. So without saying too much about whose ever sexuality, it's just very interesting stuff to look at. Finally, too, I would also highly suggest looking up the word Iona, look and trying to figure out maybe the etymology of the word, who was the word, is there some sort of mythological figure that had a name like this one or close to it, and what does that image represent? And then I would just research everything I could find out about that, and start writing it down and making conscious connections as much as possible. That's how these things start to come alive.
Thank you, Cody. Just dream work is sexy. Come on in, Philip.
Thank you. I didn't know I was next up. God, I have so many things to say. Thank you, Cody. I'm so glad you got into the dream work after you wrote the book. I find that so amusing because the book is just fine the way it is, but now you've expanded all our consciousness. I had to run over to my bookshelves and pull out. I mean, I have 27 books on dream interpretation. I've been working with dreams for 35 years, but if anybody's looking for, a basic text on practical dream work, just look up Jeremy Taylor on Amazon and see if you can find any one of his little books. There's still in print or used. And I wanted to mention Robert Johnson, who a good introduction to dream work, if you've never looked at your dreams, is to try to remember if you had a recurring dream in your childhood, because Robert Johnson quite says how important these recurring dreams are, as they sort of are a map of the structure of your life. Interesting stuff. Thanks again. I wish I could talk more, but I'll shut up.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Philip.
Philip. Much appreciated. Very nice. Thanks for the
Hey.
sharing the books too. It's great. Any resources are really helpful. So thank you.
Thanks, James. Come on in.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Cody, following up from Philip's point there, the question I was out of a dream, a recurring dream that I had, certainly in childhood, if not early teens, was a dream where I was constantly falling, but never hitting the ground, never actually touching the ground. That was a dream that I had for a long time, and maybe it stopped in teenage years. A question that I really wanted to ask was the symbolism. Snakes. All throughout human cultures, ancient cultures to present day, snakes have played a big role. Egyptian culture, snakes were a symbol of power. You spoke in your presentation that the alchemists, snakes were symbols for them. Can you speak on why this? In the Christian Bible, the snake is the bad guy. This contradiction that we have regarding snakes and what it is as a symbol. And finally, I'm really glad that snake didn't get a nibble at you as you were running.
Yeah. No. So regarding the dream of the falling, it's a couple days ago, I think I read something about that. It seemed like, I can't remember what it was. It might have been on social media or something, but I think it would be interesting. I mean, the falling in dreams that because I experience it too. climbing up something and then either making it to the top or, like I said, tumbling back down to the bottom. And I always was like really nervous about this image because I was like, oh, this couldn't be good. Like I'm falling. But actually though, in terms of alchemy, like it's a good image because what it symbolizes is the mixture, right? This kind of mixture that's happening of a conjunction of the opposites, right? So if you have air and water, or fire and earth, or just the opposites, the you have the masculine and the feminine, so that the movement from one to the other quickly, this enantiodromia, or that pendulum, right, that someone else dreamed about. So that's a symbol of this conjunction of the opposites that takes place. So it's represented in alchemy by the shaking of the thing to mix the chemicals up, right, to sort of create a mixture. So the falling is like that. In terms of the snake, I think it's just a huge symbol. I think I mean, it's such an old idea, right? An old archetype. I find it very interesting that the snake in the Garden of Eden is the one who brings knowledge, right? Who sort of is here to dispel the secret. Um, in an old Egyptian myth, there was angels who came down to dispel the secret to Isis, right? And so, and both myths are kind of the creation myths, and it's interesting that when it's the snake that's doing it, we see that as being sort of the instinctual complexes that are trying to get our attention, right? That like what can we learn from having this drive, when our body is like, you must do this, right? Like you must eat the chocolate cake or whatever it is. That's sort of that snake element. Whereas if we're getting compelled from above, by an angel or whatever it is, then that's sort of the archetypal element, right? If instinct and archetype are sort of the same thing on this spectrum, then I think it's fascinating to look at those things. And if a snake is showing up in your dreams, that's a really important symbol and one to pay attention to. It's sort of a symbol of like it's almost like the most archetypal, instinctual self that we are, right? It's like all it is like a vertebrae and like a nervous system, right? There's no arms, there's no legs, there's no nothing else. It's just the core of what it means to be a human. The most kind of bare bones existence as a human being, I think, is what the snake really can represent. So among so many other things, for sure.
Thank you. From the chat. When I was young and my father was abusive, I'd have recurring dreams that I was screaming or talking and no voice was coming out. Maybe it was in the hypnagogic state or sleep paralysis.
That's a very important image. And I think it's one maybe that's worth revisiting as through active imagination. I mean, I'm not a therapist or an analyst or anything like that, but it's clearly a very important like image that this young person doesn't have a voice, right? And what I've found is that a lot of these images are very old in my life. So, and I don't remember dreams from when I was younger, but there are some images that I do remember that have stuck with me. And through the process of active imagination and journaling, we can use our imagination to allow these symbols to do their own evolving. And so maybe something you could consider would be to allow this image to get a voice, or to give it words or anything like that. It's this spirituality is our own path. It's our own way. So anything you feel compelled to do with any of these images, we can sort of help them move along in the process of transformation. So thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Here's another dream from the chat. I was licking a giant-sized black sculpture of a Buddha in the testicle area. Then it turned to flesh and a pale color. I got a shock and then I woke up.
I mean, this is such a great dream. Um, so without, I mean, without knowing whether it's a male or a female, because I think that whoever,
Female.
yeah. So, I mean, what a profound dream that just can have so much meaning. I got so yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how I could interpret it. I think that it's important though. I think did you say that there was did something emerge? Like what happened right at the end after the turning?
The Buddha turned to flesh and then a pale color. Then there was
Yeah.
a shock, and then she woke up.
Yeah. So it's very interesting here. So for example, if I was just to give this kind of a whirl, would be that if we have like a statue, right? And then we engage with this statue in a sort of instinctual way, that and even you know that if we if we approach religion from this kind of more raw and unfiltered way, that religion will come alive, right? That the statue turns into a person, right? So this would be a coagulatio image, I think, in terms of alchemy, where the thing becomes flesh. That's a clear kind of a clear transformation, and it's important in terms of development, right? That we make all of these theories and these ideas, that we bring them to life, and we don't bring them to life by being more righteous, right? We bring them to life by getting down and dirty with them, and just being human, right? So I think it's a really interesting image, and I think you know, I love it.
Thank you. Antoinette, please come in.
Yeah, yeah. Hi.
Oh, you're muted.
Let's try that again. Antoinette, try again.
And okay, I'm trying to.
Okay, one.
Hang on.
Okay.
Okay. Am I?
Okay.
Yeah. Now,
Don't
gotcha.
touch it. Don't touch it.
Okay. Okay. Were you gonna ask me something? Sorry.
You have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, no, thanks. That was my dream about the Buddha. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Liz.
Hey, thank you so much. Okay, well, one thing was like, when do you know if it's a symbol that's like archetypal arriving versus just stuff that's happened in your day, and it's just you've just seen so much of it that it's trickling in, like how to know if it's just, yeah, that question. I've also had, I change into the characters that I'm watching, like they're main characters, and then I end up becoming them, or yeah, and it's often a male or a child. Yeah, those are the questions. And then also last night I dreamt that I was in a high rise in a Mexican apartment, and I was going to jump off of the apartment patio onto 7 floors down. I was on the 8th floor, 7 floors down into a pool, and I was taking my shoes off, and someone covert watched me and observed that I'd taken my shoes off in preparation, and I was sort of like caught, and then I decided to not do the jump and stay in the apartment. And the woman was a drummer. She had a drum kit in the back. Yeah, so yeah, thanks.
Love it. No, I think it's a really great question as to how do we begin to parse out like what's just kind of this random sort of individual unconscious versus what's kind of emanating from the deeper layers of the collective unconscious. You know, I mean, obviously, I think it takes practice to begin to figure that out. And I think that we want to be careful we don't just kind of assume that things are just sort of like random, like not really important, because I find that the psyche really can use like okay, for example, I want to tell you guys a dream that I had. I think this gives a pretty good example. So I was hired to install rain gutters, which I do rain gutters for a living, at LeBron James's house. And when I get there, it's this giant mansion, and I walk around, and the person showing me the job, he takes me into this back room, and then there's a person laying on the ground, like a little white guy. His name is Lucas, and he's showing me pictures of LeBron James naked with his wife, and he's telling me how bad LeBron James is. And I'm thinking, oh, I could probably take this guy's job because LeBron James was my friend. So that's the dream. Now, on the surface, this is because literally what's freaking hilarious is that Luka Doncic had just been traded to the Lakers, and that the guy laying on the ground's name was Lucas, right? So, and that occurred to me like a couple hours later, but this is still a dream of an archetypal nature because LeBron James is the king. That's his nickname. And so this dream then has meaning in regards to my own psyche, my own dominant psychic kind of consciousness, right? The king is a representation of the psychic dominant, the ego, the thing that the ego's most sort of fixated on. And then this Luca character is a representation of my shadow. So, and I haven't really done a lot of work on this dream. I know it's got a lot more kind of deep meaning, but the point is that it looks on the surface as if it's almost nothing, almost like a silly kind of. I mean, I find that the unconscious is hilarious sometimes, right? That it'll use these symbols that are just and sort of just twist them around, but that they still have this meaning. So I think it's important to do the research and try to really figure out like what are the ins and outs of these symbols and how is this archetypal, even though it doesn't look like it. And also, I think anytime there's a recurring image, a little, like for me, I have these little plastic parts that just keep showing up in my dreams, these random little plastic pieces of nothing, but they show up all the time. And I have no idea what they mean. I'm still trying to figure it out, and more as things evolve, I'll probably get more insight into what the psyche's trying to tell me. So thank you.
Thanks, Cody. From the chat, last night a drummer saved my life.
I love it. I mean, there could be, it could be so many different things, right? But rhythm is one thing. Drums tend to be the foundation of of sort of music, of art, right? Like the underlying kind of rhythm, the rhythm of life. Drums are very important in terms of ancient cultures. Like you could Google that up and find a lot of meaning in terms of drums. Drums are very have a lot of meaning. So for a drummer to save your life, well, that could be good or bad, right? Because oftentimes, and this goes back to the dream of jumping off the 8th floor, 7 stories down, which those numbers are highly significant. But that somebody came and stopped you from doing so. So on the surface, we think, oh, good, I didn't kill myself. But there might be a twist in there because in terms of like within alchemy, the king must die. Like that's the whole point. Like the king has to die so that he can be born again. So Jesus had to die, right? This is a recurring theme in these symbols. And so not dying isn't always great. It could mean that we're sort of clutching on to something that actually needs to die. Just a thought though. You have to really figure that out for yourself. I'm not trying to, I want to be really careful here. If we knew each other more closely, like we could really talk about this stuff a little deeper, but these are just I'm just kind of shooting in the dark with some of these interpretations or whatever. So just FYI.
Cody, thank you, Cody. We are at the 2-hour mark since we started. There's a lot of sharing in the chat, but I don't see more questions. Is there more you want to share, or are you getting hungry for lunch? Where are you now at the 2 hour?
Ming gave me a snack, but I wish I could stay. This is great. I have appointments. I have a job. You know, I'm so sorry.
Sorry about that, Cody. Okay, well, why don't I move to close the formal gathering here, and then
Okay.
you can go to work and I can stay here and goof around with people
All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, everyone.
during our fellowship.